EDHREC is a tool that collects deck data from across the internet, and which creates pages for each commander that contain the cards commonly played in them. I have spoken before about how using EDHREC for all of your deck building needs can lead to decks that are flat, formulaic, and missing lots of great tools. And I've also spoken about how lots of people building decks mostly with EDHREC causes a handful of unintended side effects for the broader Commander ecosystem. These things are true, and I stand by them. But I've also seen some players take things too far in the opposite direction, decrying EDHREC as a useless tool for anybody but the least creative deck builders and giving themselves a hearty pat on the back for staying away from it. In reality, EDHREC is an intensely useful website that has the capability to make your decks better, more interesting, even more unique in some ways, if you know how to use it correctly. So, in this video, I want to dial in on EDHREC as a tool, and talk about how I use it, when during deck building I use it, what specific features I use, and things I like to be careful of to prevent unintended consequences. To start with, there are two main times when I use EDHREC during deck building. Very early in the process of building a deck, and then sporadically closer to the end of deck building. These two timeframes serve very different purposes. Early in the process of deck building, I just want to get a lay of the land. EDHREC is useful as a shortcut for seeing the most popular, and often the most powerful, stuff you can do with a commander. In some cases, these will be the flashiest plays you can do with a given commander. We can see Fists of Flame at the top of the Zada page, Curiosity at the top of the Niv-Mizzet Parun page, and Parhelion II at the top of the Greasefang page. Even if you don't intend to use the stuff at the top of an EDHREC page, it's good to know what's there. If you're looking to build a deck around Animar, a popular commander, it's good to know that more than half of Animar players are playing him as some form of combo deck, because that will impact how your deck is perceived and what other players will be on the lookout for. In other cases, the top of an EDHREC page might be more like the points of agreement between different builds of a commander. For something like Atraxa Grand Unifier, we see some popular removal spells and some flicker cards to repeat the commander's powerful ETB, but after that, the play rates of different cards fall off pretty fast, with players choosing a variety of different approaches for the specifics of their deck. In this case, I could go, okay, I guess I'll start with Flicker, and then decide the specifics of how I want to do that, and if I want to be among the roughly 25% of CEDH players playing Atraxa, judging by this page. Typically, I'll look at an EDHREC page at first to see any super obvious build paths that other people have been doing, but then once I've decided to build a particular commander, I'll click away for a while. It's useful to know the basics of what other people are doing, but the longer you spend on this unaltered EDHREC page without looking elsewhere, the more you'll get sucked into the stuff on this page and subconsciously let it decide what your deck wants to be for you. In cases when I'm using a top-down approach to build a deck, basically finding a commander I like with a card or two in mind, I like to get out of EDHREC pretty early so that the foundations of the deck aren't too influenced by what's popular. In the early stages of building a deck, I don't really want to know that 47% of other Imscure players are using Deadly Dispute, because that colors my opinion of the card at a stage in deck building when I want to be exploring possibilities and keeping an open mind to different options with the commander. Other players might be different, but I find that the progression of gradually building up in cards and plugging in different Scryfall searches as I figure out different ways the deck could play is really valuable as a creative step. It's a stage in deck building that I want to preserve as much as possible. Regardless of your exact preferences, if you're starting your deck building journey on EDHREC, I strongly recommend you click away to futz around with your own thing for a while, at some point. For me, EDHREC comes back into the picture a bit later once I've discovered a fair number of cards and have a decently strong concept of my deck, but haven't fully ironed out an initial draft yet. Whereas the initial usage of EDHREC was to get a lay of the land and see a handful of basic build paths, in this later stage of EDHREC usage, I am looking for specific cards. Scryfall is a lovely tool, but there are some things that it just won't hit in any reasonable number of searches. Dourport Mage won't show up in any common searches you might make for a Flicker deck, and if you're building a Karametra deck, self-bouncers like Whitemane Lion might not even enter your radar if you're not already in the know. This is where EDHREC is helpful. It can help you fill in the gaps with popular cards that Scryfall searches might have missed. Even if a particular card isn't showing up on the EDHREC page due to not being popular enough, looking at EDHREC can still help you find that card. If you're building a Cast from Exile deck, you'll probably find a bunch of payoffs for casting things from exile from Scryfall searches on your own, but a brief trip to the Prosper EDHREC page might clue you in on the words "from anywhere other than your hand." Suddenly, that's a whole new avenue to take a stroll down, and you might find yourself a lovely memory worm. Get in here, you funky little guy. Okay, so at this point you hopefully have a good idea of when I like to use EDHREC and why I use it at those times. Deck building is a very personal process, and you may have your own preferences, but ideally you'll be starting to get a better sense of what role the website should have in your deck building. However, in covering the when and the why, I've so far skipped over the how, arguably the most important part. This might be confusing to a lot of people because, on a basic level, EDHREC is very easy to use. You pop open the website, find your commander, and you're off to the races. Easy as cake, right? Wrong. This page sucks if you're looking for card choices for your specific deck because it includes every deck for a commander, even plenty that look nothing like the one you're trying to build. I think we as EDH players have a tendency to treat commanders as whole entities, like characters selected from a grid in a fighting game. This game is Carter versus Zur versus Sir Conrad versus one of the 63 Kellans. What a legendary matchup. Wanting to simplify this one thing is an understandable impulse given the intense complexity of the commander format, but sadly it's an incorrect impulse. Decks with a given commander can vary dramatically from one another, and the more diverse a given commander's decks are, the less helpful the base EDHREC page will be. So what's the solution? The answer is filters, which I make very heavy use of once I'm further along and in that card gleaning stage of EDHREC usage. By default, the website will draw data from all decks in its database for a given commander, but the filters option allows you to filter out decks that do or don't include a given card. Now you could put all sorts of stuff in this, but the most useful type of card will be what I like to call indicator cards, which are basically just cards that fit very cleanly in or out of a given archetype. For example, if we go to the page of Kellan Inquisitive Prodigy, we see a melange of different elements, but the most prominent ones are things involving clues, which kind of makes sense given that green-blue clues is an established Innistrad archetype. This is going to be helpful to some people, but what if I'm looking for a higher curved deck, maybe even considering the inclusion of Keruga as a companion? In that case, this page won't do much for me before a bit of filtering, and the one card near the top of the page that really stands out as a big mana option is Map the Frontier, a 4-mana sorcery that searches up 2 basic lands and or deserts to the field. And actually, this works great as an indicator card because it's not the sort of card that most decks will want. Mana ramp past 2, maybe 3 mana stuff will typically only be included in a deck if it fits with the deck's synergies, so the presence of more expensive ramp will generally be a good sign that a deck has a big mana game plan. Sure enough, that's reflected after filtering. We see lots of higher cost cards that would require mana investment to succeed, as well as lots of great tools for a Keruga deck. So that's one example, but what about an example of an anti-indicator card? A while back, I was brewing a Carter control deck, sort of like a red flicker deck. A major goal of the deck is to have a basically unlimited supply of Disrupt Decorums available, since Carter has that effect on ETB, and ETBs can be repeated with a card like Jaxus that can produce a token copy of a creature each turn. I thought this was a sensible enough plan for the commander, but when I went to the EDHREC page, a number of the more commonly played cards themselves did goad-related things. Initially, I was pretty shocked that around half of all Carter players felt the need to run cards that do the same thing as their commander, but that's their business, not mine. The important thing is what happened next. I filtered the results. One option could be to filter by cards I know I want in the deck, such as a couple red flicker staples like Jaxus and Conjurer's Closet. However, the result is pretty muddy, with Disrupt Decorum now showing up in an even greater proportion of decks. The issue is that these red flicker cards don't do anything to indicate a player who is averse to redundancy, as I am to some extent. There are plenty of Goad Maxers out there who will take the flicker stuff and the additional copies of Goad cards because they just like disrupting Decorum that much. No, the way to start sculpting a helpful EDHREC page in this case is to exclude the cards that do the same thing as the commander, such as Disrupt Decorum and Geode Rager, and after that, the page starts looking a lot more helpful. There's still some of this that's probably outside what my deck would want to do, but at least the Goad stuff is mostly out of the way. Vengeful Ancestor is only in 12% of the remaining decks after this filtering, down from 43% on the base page. As a final example of filtering, let's talk about how to combine includes and excludes. Back when I had a Liesa Hate Bears deck, I'd periodically check EDHREC to see if anything was catching my eye, but for this to work I needed to filter the page first. The most popular build of Liesa is Life Gain, and though I don't mind a little life gain to offset Liesa's drain, it's definitely not what the deck is built around. A first step could be excluding some core life gain cards, such as Soul Warden, but this isn't all that effective because life gain is just such a dominant archetype, and there are plenty of life gain decks not including a certain life gain card for one reason or another. A different approach is to filter for inclusion of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which is basically the first card I'd add to any Hate Bears deck, and this is a bit more effective, but life gain cards still start creeping in at around 25% inclusion. What works best is the combined approach. If I filter for decks that include Thalia and exclude Soul Warden, life gain is basically obliterated from the page, with a Well of Lost Dreams and 2 Sanguine Bond effects being the only life gain payoffs remaining on the page. This also still leaves a healthy 550 decks, since I didn't need to throw a whole bunch of cards into my filters in order to get the desired results. You can do something similar with price if you're looking for a budget deck. If a base EDHREC page is helpful aside from the cards being too pricey, you could exclude an expensive card and include something cheap like a solid budget land. Suddenly, the cards on the page will be much more in your budget. It becomes more clear just how important filtering is when you think about an EDHREC page as a cross-section of a handful of different overlapping decks. Some commanders will be pretty straightforward and less diverse. If we go to the Prosper EDHREC page, there are almost 30 non-land cards that show up in more than 50% of Prosper decks. Meanwhile, if we look at a similarly popular but more open-ended commander, Alela Artful Provocateur, that number is less than half of that, and some commanders, like Glissa Sunslayer, have almost no cards above the 50% played threshold. For commanders with a singular, more streamlined play path, the base EDHREC page can be moderately helpful, but for a more diverse commander, the page might be pure soup, an unfiltered mishmash of different archetypes interspersed across the page. I actually made a video last year about exactly these sorts of commanders, with Arkelos, Francisco Malcolm, and Skeleton Ship as examples. The EDHREC pages of these commanders are equal parts interesting to dig into and instructive for seeing the limits of an unfiltered EDHREC page. I'm also very interested in what causes a commander's EDHREC page to be more diverse or less diverse, so I actually ended up working with my brother to analyze a whole bunch of EDHREC pages, and we made a whole video about it over on my second channel, complete with a tool to analyze your own commanders. I'll include a preview of that at the end of this video. Regardless of what exact commanders you're using, filters are an important thing to have in your repertoire if you're using EDHREC. The website as a whole is a very useful tool, both for getting a sense of the broader play rates of a commander and for finding specific cards. But if you're using it for the latter purpose, using filters will save you a lot of time and effort, and also show you more cards. EDHREC pages will typically show about 300 cards. And that's a decent amount if most of the cards are ones you'd actually consider. But if 2/3 of them are for disparate archetypes that you didn't put in the effort to filter out, suddenly you're getting a lot less useful information out of the page. So use filters. They're good. As a final note, using EDHREC in general will likely help your deck out in some form, but I've found that getting the best usage out of it requires some level of detachment from the website. Using other resources and giving yourself a chance to feel out where your deck wants to go will help in giving your ideas room to breathe, away from the constant input of how popular cards are. When you are using EDHREC, it's useful to sometimes take a step back and remember what the information on your screen is telling you. The stuff at the top of an EDHREC page is simply the stuff that a bunch of people decided should go in their deck. Different people might be building decks in different ways and for different reasons than you are, so a card being up there isn't necessarily a positive or negative statement about it, but it is a very informative one. Even just taking a bit to think to yourself about why a given card might be present at a certain position on the page and what sorts of decks it might be played in is a really helpful exercise that will make you a lot better at processing the stuff that's on your screen, and better at understanding the EDH ecosystem in general. Any tool will be much more useful to you if you can get a sense of why it's doing exactly what it's doing. Thanks for watching, and thanks to EDHREC for sponsoring this video. I also want to thank Archidekt for their ongoing support of the channel, and its integration of EDHREC's SALT scores and user-pulled combo database can provide interesting tools for seeing how other people might see your deck. Additionally, I want to thank my patrons and YouTube members for their support, some of whom are on screen now. As a final note, the Command Zone just put out a super fun and high-effort video a couple days ago to go with Edge of Eternities, and you should definitely check it out if you haven't already. A link to that is in the description. With that said, here's a preview of the EDHREC Analyzer video, which will be over on my second channel, also linked in the description. To get us started answering those questions, I partnered with my brother Ian, who's much better at coding than I am, to build a tool that can give me some information about an EDHREC page and compare it to others. The end product was this, a tool where you can input a commander and it ranks it on a few different metrics. Let's jump over to Ian to talk us through the basics. So now there are a few different metrics this is analyzing, right? You've got entropy, synergy, and hipster cards. Do you want to just go through those?
Yeah, so first up is entropy, and that is a fancy data science term for the variation and chaos within a data set. So really what it's looking at is how unpopular the average card is. So it's a logarithmic scale, so 1.0 is the average card is played at a 50% rate, 2.0 is the average card is played at a 25% rate, and it's just a good measure for how much a deck is concentrated on one main archetype or if it's spread out amongst a bunch of different themes.